სოციალური ტრანსფორმაცია სამხრეთ ამერიკაში არის ამ ევროპული კვლევის ნაწილი. შეიძლება დაფიქრდეთ იმ შესახებ თუ რა შუაში ევროპის კვლევასთან სამხრეთ ამერიკა, მაგრამ ჩვენ ვეცადეთ რომ მაქსიმალურად დაგვიფართოვებინა სპექტრი თემებისა, რომელიც საფუძვლად შეიძლება სოციალური ტრანსფორმაციის ზოგადი შერჩეული თემის ფარგლებში. შესაძლებლობა არის ასეთი ადამიანების გაცნობა, რომელიც ყავს დღეს სტუმრად, რომელსაც წარმოგიდგენთ ბრაზილიის ელჩი საქართველოში Baki diaspora.
Dear friends, welcome to this event organized by Europe House. As it's been announced, I'm the ambassador of Brazil in Tbilisi, and I was asked to moderate this session. And a little bit of an extra time, I was also asked to say a few words about the topic we're going to discuss, which is social change in Latin America. And before introducing our two keynote speakers, I would say a few words about social changes in Brazil, if I may. The disparities in Brazilian society have been the subject of much attention in the world press and internationally. And Brazil has had to face this major problem related to social disparities, which is not actually a problem that affects us alone. Many other countries have this problem, but the case of Brazil is a bit specific because when the Portuguese arrived in the year 1500, they initiated a system that was based on a notion of feudalism, the type of feudalism that was existent in Europe at the time. And since Portugal didn't have the means to control such a huge territory, the Portuguese king established a feudal system, a hereditary feudal system, dividing Brazil into captaincies. And throughout the years, the first products that were sold in international markets from Brazil required a high level of manpower. So for this purpose, the Portuguese decided to use slaves. And Brazil had a lot of African slaves, with a little help from the Dutch also, who participated actively in the slave trade. But the fact that Brazil was based from its beginning on feudalism and slavery made the society, by definition, very unequal. So we had to come a long way to try to bridge the gaps. And in recent times, since the 90s, since the redemocratization of Brazil, a lot of things have been done by the successive governments to improve the situation of the lesser favored classes in Brazil. And like I said, this is not a problem that happens to us alone. I happened to be posted some years ago to Chile, and Chile is seen worldwide as an example of a modern, progressive country. It has an agreement with the European Union, an agreement that is so significant that at the time when it was signed and came into power in Chile, the Chileans said that they became actually a European country. And still in those days, Chile had almost as much inequalities as Brazil. It was number 2. Brazil had the sad title of being the region's champion in inequalities, but Chile was number 2. So even such a modern and progressive country, such as Chile, had the same problems. And we had to deal with a military dictatorship for 20 years, from the mid-60s to the mid-80s. And though it was conservative by nature, it was a right-wing military dictatorship, conservative by nature, but still they had to let go of some social principles, and so the political life of the country was very reduced in those years. But social change had to occur because the world was changing a lot in those years. And so even during the military dictatorship, Brazil had made some advances in its social structure. And I'd just like to mention a few specific aspects where change has occurred in Brazil with very concrete examples. Something has to be said, for instance, about the black population of Brazil, which amounts to about 50% of the country, and still doesn't have the same presence on the higher echelons of society as, let's say, the Europeans have. But to give you an example of something that happened in my country, at some point the foreign ministry to which I belong decided that there were not enough Negroes in our cadres, and a program was created to grant scholarships to Afro-descendants to allow them to prepare for the entrance exams of the diplomatic academy. So in order to enable Afro-descendants to join the diplomatic career in Brazil, the foreign ministry offered scholarships to students so as to allow them to be in equal conditions to compete in the entrance exams. And it was quite successful. Nowadays we have a lot more people of African origin in the diplomatic career than before, including ambassadors and everything. This is a specific example, but I'd like to mention it. In the case of family and family life, Brazil is a very strongly Catholic country. Had no divorce. We didn't have the possibility to divorce until we had one of the military dictators who happened to be a Lutheran. He was of German descent from southern Brazil, where lots of people from German origin. And he was one of them, and he was a Lutheran, Baki. Excuse me. So it was only under this general guidance that finally Brazil managed to have divorce, which also is a vivid example of a social change in the country that happened. Something has to be said also about birth control in Brazil, which was something that was never very strongly influenced neither by the government policies. Of course, the Catholic Church was strongly against it. The military dictatorship was not in favor of birth control because they wanted to make Brazil a world power, and for such they needed more people. And still, the Brazilian people themselves realized the importance of having smaller families so as to be able to provide a better chance for their kids. So the population diminished its growth in a very relative small amount of time. And finally, about same-sex unions, Brazil also has evolved throughout the years. And last year, the Brazilian Supreme Court unanimously approved equal rights for same-sex couples in Brazil, which is another proof of social change and evolution in the Brazilian society. But there's a lot of room for improvement. It doesn't mean that we have achieved everything. There is a lot of room for improvement. So I just wanted to say these few words to kind of launch the spirit of the discussions.
Very briefly, I'd like to move forward with the comments that the ambassador was making about the case of Brazil, and try to perhaps broaden them into a more general reflection on social change and evolution in Latin America today, and then place it in the context of a more regional division. I think we have seen two types of countries in Latin America. This is one division we can see between two types of countries. Those countries like Brazil, and a few others which I'll mention, where finally the middle class has begun to grow. This really is a central change, I believe, in Latin America today, that after a long period of time which lasted until the 1930s, more or less, when there was, other than Argentina and Uruguay to a lesser extent, no middle class, or practically no middle class. Between 1940 and 1980, a small middle class emerged, 25, 30, 30% of the population. This was a middle class which could have tens of millions of people, because 30% of the country, which then had 120 million inhabitants like Brazil, is still 40 million people in Spain. It's a lot of people. But this was a minority of the population. The same was true in Mexico. The same was true in almost every Latin American country. A middle class emerged, but it could not go ever beyond 25, maybe 30% of the population. The other 65% were poor, and you had a very small elite which was very rich. And practically every country in Latin America looked the same. The two exceptions up to a point were Argentina and Uruguay. And this situation continued for half a century. It didn't change. But finally, towards the end of the 20th century, and over the last 12 to 15 years now, this has begun to change. And in a small group of countries, it is not all of them by any definition, the middle class has finally become a majority of the population. A small majority, 55, 54, 56% of the population. And this is not a definitive process. You can go backwards. And it's not exactly the same middle class as the one that you can see in Europe or the United States or Canada or Japan or Korea. It's somewhat different, but still, in countries like Brazil, like Mexico, like Chile, like Uruguay, practically those four, I think, would be the most important ones, perhaps Costa Rica. You now have a majority of the population which belongs to what you can call a middle class. They have access to credit, they have cars, they have health insurance, they have vacations, they have access to higher education, public or private. If it's private, it can be expensive. Sometimes it's also expensive. Have access to housing, have access to all of the goods and services which are traditionally identified with middle class consumption patterns. Refrigerators, televisions, cell phones, computers, internet, etc., etc., etc. This is an enormous change in these countries. It had not happened before. It is not certain that it will last, and it is not certain that other countries in Latin America will be able to follow. This has been partly the result of proper public policies, partly the result of good luck, particularly, for example, in the case of commodity exporting countries, either through exports or through foreign investment, have enjoyed an incredible boom the last 10 years because of the high prices of certain commodities. Partly the result also of just, and I think this is the main factor contributing to this, partly the result of stable macroeconomic policies.